I never planned to speak that day. I was supposed to sit quietly, just another observer in a room filled with brass and procedure. But when they asked if anyone had information to contribute, I stood, not as a daughter, not as the quiet girl who once followed orders without question. I stood as a soldier, with a folder full of evidence and a voice I had waited years to use. My father was across the room, arms folded, eyes sharp. When I finished laying out the truth, he didn't deny a thing. He just said 4 words. And what came after changed everything. The sun over Fort Dalton hit differently than anywhere else. It wasn't just the Texas heat, dry and weighty like it had something to prove. It was the way the gravel crunched beneath boots, the way the wind carried faint echoes of commands barked long ago. For some, this place was just another training site. For me, it was history, and not the kind etched on plaques or remembered with pride. I hadn't set foot here in over 5 years, not since my last classified deployment. Yet as soon as the gate clanked shut behind me, it all came rushing back. Memories I thought I'd buried under desert storms and midnight ops. I wasn't here today as a name anyone recognized. That was intentional. My ID was stripped of rank, my paperwork buried beneath layers of anonymity. I asked for that. No ribbons, no briefing intro, no whispered reputation trailing behind me. Just Grace Bennett, no title, no history. Let the assumptions do their work. Let them underestimate me. I carried only what mattered. 1 bag, 1 rifle, my M24 weathered battle-worn dependable. It had been with me through more than I'd ever admit. I'd cleaned it more times than I'd spoken to some of my family members. Every scratch along the barrel, every imperfection held more truth than years of forced smiles at holiday dinners. I didn't need a new weapon. I needed one that knew me, one that had stayed steady when everything else had shifted. As I walked across the lot toward the range, soldiers bustled around in small clusters. Some joked, some postured, others tuned their gear with that familiar tension of trying to look relaxed. Most were younger, 20s, lean, still shiny from training. Their boots weren't scuffed yet. Their egos hadn't cracked. Not really. I kept my eyes forward. And then I saw him. He stood near the center tower clipboard in hand shoulders square like he was still in command even if his uniform said retired. The same old cap worn low casting a shadow that had once made reading his expression near impossible. That posture of his hadn't changed. A stiffness that suggested the weight of responsibility, but in truth it was the weight of control. Michael Bennett didn't relax. He didn't yield. Even now in the twilight of his influence, he carried himself like a man convinced the world still owed him attention. He didn't see me. Not yet. But I saw him. And more than that, I felt him. The same way a body remembers the cold before a storm. My grip on the rifle case tightened. I reminded myself that I wasn't here for him. I wasn't here to prove anything. And yet somewhere deep inside, the old ache stirred like a splinter left beneath the skin too long. He was surrounded by a few instructors, talking low, scanning the roster. I knew my name was on there, but it wouldn't mean anything to him. Not without a title. Not without his stamp of approval. I had deliberately ensured it'd be just G. Bennett. Let it pass under his nose. Let him overlook me like he always had. I was assigned Lane 7. That made me pause. Not visibly, but enough to feel the ripple in my chest. Lane 7 had always been the forgotten corner of the range. It sat just far enough from the main lanes to be considered inconvenient, but not abandoned. It was where I used to watch from the sidelines during family training days, too young to be invited, too eager to pretend I wasn't. I used to trail behind him here, thinking every echoing shot was part of some heroic legend. Back then I thought he was untouchable. Now I understood he was just loud. I made my way there without a word, without drawing a single glance. Perfect. That's how I liked it. The lane was dusty, the bench worn, the shade minimal, but it was mine for the day. Just me, the wind, and a rifle that had been through hell with me. I set the bag down, unzipped it with precision, and laid the M24 across the bench like I was greeting an old friend. The sweat had already begun to gather at the back of my neck. I rolled up my sleeves, not for display, just comfort. Still, the ink on my forearm caught the light. It was faded now. Not designed, not pretty, just real. A marker of what had been earned in silence, not ceremony. As I ran a cloth along the barrel, checking alignment, I felt it. That shift in air. That awareness when someone's eyes land on you. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. I knew it was him. His stare had weight. Not curiosity, not recognition, just cold assessment, like he was scanning a recruit. I didn't offer a nod, didn't smile. I'd done that dance before. Offering pieces of myself for approval that never came. I wasn't 13 anymore. I wasn't the girl he called emotional or defiant or impractical. I was the woman who'd stood in silence during storms, who'd crawled through debris to pull civilians from buildings most people couldn't pronounce. And I didn't need him to know that. I just needed him to see. Michael Bennett looked at me and didn't recognize what he saw. That was fine, that was better. He turned away. That small dismissal, that tiny flick of indifference, it stung more than I wanted to admit. Not because I needed his validation, but because I remembered what it used to mean. How his silence in a room could shape the entire mood of a family dinner. How a single glance could unravel weeks of effort. He never had to raise his voice. His disapproval was a colder kind of punishment. Someone near the central lanes cracked a joke. I heard my last name muttered with amusement. Probably a young soldier who saw Bennett on the list and figured nepotism brought me here. I didn't flinch. Let them joke. Let them laugh. The difference this time was I didn't carry the urge to explain myself. Not anymore. I checked the scope, loaded a blank round to run a function test. Everything clicked into place with that satisfying familiarity that only comes from years of trust. I could have done it blindfolded. Behind me, footsteps crunched closer. I heard the low rumble of a familiar voice. Lane. 7. He said, his tone just loud enough to carry. Feel like taking a shot. Just for fun. There it was. The same line he'd used on countless rookies. The same condescending chuckle wrapped in faux kindness. But when he said it to me, it carried the weight of memory. Of every time he'd told someone I wasn't ready. Of every look that said I didn't belong. I didn't answer. Not yet. Someone nearby chuckled. Another muttered, "She's getting volunteered." Of course I was. That was his way. Set the trap with a joke, then watch to see who stumbles into it. If you failed, it proved his point. If you succeeded, he'd say it didn't count. You were either too weak or trying too hard. There was no winning. Except there was, just not in his playbook. I rose slowly, deliberate. Just another soldier following orders. No drama, no fire, just calm. Someone clapped mockingly. Another whistled. Let them believe this was entertainment. Because what was coming next wasn't for them. And it wasn't for him either. It was for the girl who once sat alone at the edge of Lane 7 watching from behind safety glasses and hoping one day someone would invite her to the line. It was for the soldier who spent years being told she was too quiet, too soft, too complicated to lead. I didn't need an invitation anymore. I had already arrived. They say some shadows are cast by trees, others by people. But the deepest ones are cast by legacies, especially the kind that come wearing a uniform. In my family, the Bennett name didn't just mean discipline or service. It meant expectation, duty, control. My grandfather fought in Korea. My father, Michael Bennett, built his reputation during the Gulf. My brother Lucas walked the polished halls of West Point like he was born for it. His picture hung in our hallway before he even graduated. He was the golden child, the natural, the one who fit. And then there was me. I wasn't loud like Lucas. I didn't charm rooms. I didn't shine in the ways that made parents proud at dinner parties. I was observant, quiet. But not because I had nothing to say. I just learned early that in our house being heard was a privilege earned by fitting a mold, and I didn't. From as early as I can remember, my father made it clear that the battlefield was for the boys. He didn't say it with cruelty, just certainty. Like it was gravity. "Combat's no place for women, Grace," he'd mutter over the newspaper or while carving roast on Sunday nights. "Let the boys handle the rough stuff." I would nod and help Mom clear the table, but the words stuck. They didn't scar right away. They settled. Quiet, invisible. They became the background hum of our household. Lucas. He thrived under the weight of that belief. Tall, confident, always knowing which fork to use, how to salute before anyone taught him. My father beamed at his early enlistment paperwork, his letters home from officer training, his sharp creases and firm handshake. Born leader, he'd say like the rest of us were just satellites orbiting Lucas's star. I don't remember when exactly I decided to join. It wasn't a rebellion. I wasn't trying to prove a point. There was no grand confrontation. It was quieter than that. More instinct than inspiration. I remember holding an M4 for the first time during a base visit years ago. I felt it in my bones. It was like everything I wasn't supposed to be suddenly made sense. I wasn't reckless. I was focused. I didn't crave adrenaline. I understood structure. It wasn't that I wanted war. I just wanted purpose, precision, a kind of stillness I couldn't find anywhere else. When I told my family it was during dinner, roast beef again. My mother passed the bread. Lucas asked for more potatoes. I slid the enlistment papers across the table, hands steady. My father didn't even glance at them. He set the knife down, stood up, and walked out of the room. He didn't speak to me again for 6 months. My mother tried to soften it. "He just needs time," she whispered, like I'd broken something sacred. "He comes from another generation." But I wasn't asking for understanding. I was asking to be seen. Basic training was the first place I didn't feel like someone's daughter or someone's disappointment. I wasn't special there. In fact, I was just another number in boots too tight hauling weight I hadn't yet earned the strength to carry. But for once, no one expected me to be anything. And in that nothingness, I started to build. They assigned me to logistics first. Not glamorous. I spent months managing supply manifests, packing crates, and memorizing serial numbers. I knew every terrain route in our AO by heart, not because someone asked, but because I hated the feeling of being underestimated. Logistics taught me 2 things that would shape everything that came after: precision and patience. I didn't rush into combat roles. I earned my transfer to infantry. My CO tried to talk me out of it. "You've got a brain, Bennett," he said. "No need to go where the bullets fly." But he didn't understand. I wasn't afraid of bullets. I was afraid of getting stuck behind someone else's legacy. So I went forward. Infantry stripped me down to grit and instinct. There's no pretending in the field. You learn fast, or you fall behind. I ran further than I thought possible. I fought harder than I believed I had in me. I learned to hold the line. Not just against enemies, but against fear. Then came the selection notice. Special operations. A whisper of a chance. I volunteered. The silence started there. Not because the journey got easier, but because the ones who doubted me stopped keeping up. There's no room for ego during a 12-mile ruck under full load, no time to argue when you're being disoriented in 3 languages during scenario testing. You either show up, or you get sent home. I stayed. They called me the quiet one. Some thought I didn't speak English. Others just didn't bother asking. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. The stories started spreading, about a woman who never missed a mark, never raised her voice, never failed a field op. I became a rumor, a ghost in standard-issue boots. Some said I'd been deployed under deep cover. Others swore I'd broken a weapons ring without firing a shot. None of it was true. But I didn't correct that either. I didn't need recognition. I needed distance. Because legends are safer when they don't wear name tags. My silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. I wasn't chasing rank. I was chasing standards. Mine. Every mile I ran, every clearance I earned, every scar I tucked beneath my sleeve, they were mine. Not Lucas's, not Michael's, mine. And yet no matter how far I advanced, the shadow of home lingered. I'd hear from Lucas occasionally. Short notes, always respectful, always careful. As if he wasn't sure whether to admire me or correct me. My father never wrote, never called. But my CO once told me that my medical records and field reports were flagged regularly. He's watching, he said, just not the way I thought. That's when I realized. Michael Bennett didn't hate that I wore the uniform. He hated that I wore it better than he expected. That I had built something he couldn't define, couldn't shape. And in our world, that was the real betrayal. It wasn't about blood. It was about ownership. Lucas was his pride. I was the deviation. I didn't play by the unspoken rules, didn't wear the right kind of strength. And in a household where silence meant control, I had turned it into something else. I had made it mine. By the time I stepped onto Lane 7 that day, years later, I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I was the woman who had outlasted every expectation they once held over her. The one who had bled quietly, risen quietly, endured quietly. Not to prove a point, but to find her own. And no matter how many records I'd broken or missions I'd completed, the truth was this: I hadn't joined the army to rebel. I joined because I finally understood where I belonged. Not in someone else's spotlight, but in the silence behind the shot. Lane 7 had always been an afterthought. Tucked at the edge of the range, too far from the tower to be convenient, too isolated to draw much attention. When I was a kid tagging along on my father's duty days, I'd watch recruits rotate through that very lane, the distant ones, the ones who hadn't yet earned a center spot. It was where the overlooked went, or where the ones who didn't want to be seen chose to stand. Now I chose it deliberately. The range was alive with motion. Snipers checking optics, instructors adjusting headsets, young soldiers swapping half-serious jokes. The air smelled like dust oil and faint tension. That kind of silent current that moves through a unit before any triggers pulled. I kept my stride steady as I approached Lane 7. My M24 rested calmly in my grip, my footsteps unhurried. It wasn't nerves. It was memory. I laid the rifle on the bench with care, running my fingers down its length like reacquainting with an old friend. The weapon felt right in my hands, balanced and unyielding. Not pristine, not polished, but tested, trusted. And in this place that mattered more than any rank or ribbon. Behind me a voice cut through the morning air. Sharp, measured, familiar. Lane 7. My father called tone just loud enough to carry. Why don't you take a crack at it? Just for fun. He said it the way he always did. Like it wasn't a challenge but a joke only he understood. There it was again. That smirk in his voice wrapped in polite sarcasm. To anyone else it sounded like casual encouragement. But I knew better. That was his favorite weapon. Sarcasm laced with memory, dipped in quiet control. I didn't turn around. Didn't flinch. A chuckle rippled through a nearby cluster of soldiers. One nudged his buddy and whispered, "She's about to get volunteered." Another smirked. "Probably here to tick a box." Legacy stuff. They had no idea what they were looking at. That was fine. Let them laugh. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder, loading the first round with practiced ease. No ceremony, just routine. Like brushing dust off a book only I knew how to read. Behind me, my father's footsteps shifted his presence, settling just close enough to feel. He didn't speak again, but the weight of expectation pressed from behind. Unspoken, familiar, heavy. "Whenever you're ready," he added. I wasn't here to perform. This wasn't for them. It wasn't for him. It was for me. I leaned into the stock, letting the world fall away. The range noise dulled. The heat receded. All that remained was breath steal and distance. My pulse slowed not from detachment, but control. I'd done this before. In Aleppo, In Kandahar. On rooftops where wind whispered louder than voices. In corridors so tight I could hear my heart louder than any gunfire. First shot, clean, center. Second shot, same hole. Third, fourth, fifth. Tight grouping, barely any variance. The whispers stopped. Someone let out a quiet breath. A mutter of, "Damn," drifted through the stillness. But I wasn't listening. I didn't fire to impress. I fired because it was what I knew, what I trusted when everything else felt like a question. My rifle didn't care if I was someone's daughter. The paper target didn't lie. Every round told its own truth. 10 rounds in. Still no deviation. I shifted slightly controlled. Not stiff, just aligned. 15 shots. A hum moved through the crowd now, no longer mocking, but uncertain. 20 shots. The grouping was surgical, flawless. A name murmured from someone behind me. "Is that Bennett?" Another voice asked. "Wait, like Bennett." Nobody answered, because nobody knew what to say anymore. By the 25th shot, even the instructors had gone quiet. The Bluetooth speakers stopped. The joking stilled. I wasn't watching, but I felt it. The awareness creeping through the air like smoke. I fired the 30th round, lowered the rifle slowly, and exhaled. Silence. I rolled my shoulder once easing tension, then peeled off my gloves. The sweat along my forearm had begun to pool, clinging to the ink just beneath my sleeve. I didn't raise my arm with intention. I simply reached to adjust the strap of my vest. But that was enough. The tattoo caught the light. At first only a few noticed. Then more. A man stepped forward from the shaded cluster near the tower. Taller than the rest, built like old oak. Solid, unshaken. His silver hair was buzzed tight, and the insignia on his chest gleamed under the midday sun. Colonel Henry Braddock, a name I hadn't heard in years, but a gait I'd never forget. We had crossed paths once. Quietly. In a situation neither of us ever debriefed out loud. His gaze dropped to my forearm. Froze. I watched his posture shift just barely. His hands loosened at his sides. His brows lifted. He stepped closer. "You're her," he said, voice low, as if even he wasn't sure he believed it. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. Behind him, more officers started drifting forward, their eyes fixed not on the target but on me. One of them whispered something I couldn't hear. Another squinted at my arm, recognizing not the tattoo's design, but its implication. Only 8 of us had passed that course the year I did. 3 of them didn't survive to see retirement. The ink wasn't given. It was earned in silence and shadow and never discussed. And now here I stood in daylight at Lane 7, having just obliterated the standing record. The target retrieval system slid the paper back toward the bench. I didn't need to see it, but I looked anyway. 30 rounds, center mass, no variance. The bullseye was gone, reduced to shreds. Someone cursed under their breath. Another just said, "That's not skill. That's something else." I didn't reply. Colonel Braddock turned slightly to the instructors. "Get me that grouping," he said. His tone wasn't urgent, just grounded, like he already knew what he'd seen and just wanted it documented. He looked back at me, studied my face for the first time. His voice dropped to something almost reverent. "We thought you were a myth." I gave the smallest nod. Behind me, I could feel the shift, not just in energy, but in ownership. The story was no longer theirs to shape. It was no longer a rumor. It was real. I stepped back from the bench. No fanfare, no speech. I walked past the same soldiers who had whispered and laughed 30 minutes earlier. They didn't speak now. They didn't need to. Their silence was enough. And somewhere in that quiet I felt it. The weight of my father's stare. But I didn't turn, yea, because for the first time in my life it didn't matter whether he spoke or stayed silent. I had already said everything I needed to say. With one trigger pull at Lane 7. It didn't take long after the last shot for the whispers to start. Not the jokes or sideways smirks from earlier. Those had evaporated. This was a different kind of whisper. The kind that spreads when something challenges the narrative people thought they understood. Something that forces them to recalibrate what they thought they knew about rank, skill, and history. I stood off to the side of Lane 7, wiping down the M24 with slow, familiar strokes. The feel of the cloth against steel kept me anchored. Around me, the range hadn't gone back to normal. There was too much tension in the air, too many glances cast over shoulders, too many phones being pulled out and put away. I knew what they were doing. Googling. They were trying to match what they had just seen with something, anything, they could find online. But there wouldn't be much. That was the point. The woman they were trying to search didn't exist in interviews or promotional photos. She wasn't featured in recruitment videos or standing on stage at award ceremonies. She was rumor, a name never confirmed, a file never fully unredacted. A story passed around from one base to another, morphing every time it was told. A sniper with perfect groupings, a ghost with no unit patch, a silhouette in grainy drone footage that no one could ever quite verify. That was me, not because I wanted to be a myth, but because the work I did wasn't meant to be remembered. And now they were starting to realize that Ghost was standing 20 feet away, calmly disassembling her weapon like nothing unusual had happened. I didn't look at them. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in posture, the subtle retreat from arrogance, the sharp edge of curiosity replacing assumption. No one approached. Not yet. But their silence was loud in a new way, not mocking, not dismissive, just reverent. That's when I saw her, moving like a shadow through a crowd that didn't realize it was being watched. Her steps were deliberate but unhurried, the way only someone trained in observation could walk. Not too fast to draw attention, not too slow to look unsure. She wasn't wearing standard fatigues, no visible rank, no nameplate, but I recognized the posture instantly. Claire Monroe. I hadn't seen her in years. Not since that operation buried so deep in southern Syria that we were technically never there. She'd worked the intel side. Counterintelligence, silent clearances, the kind of clearance that probably extended to her breakfast orders. She was the one who connected dots others missed. The one who knew when not to ask a question because she already had the answer. She stopped, 3 feet in front of me. Sutton. Her eyes flicked once to the rifle, then to my hands, then to the tattoo on my arm. A pause followed, not for drama but for confirmation. "Delaney," she said flatly. Not a question. I looked up, meeting her gaze without hesitation. Recognition passed between us like static. I nodded once. Nothing more. She tilted her head slightly, a familiar quirk of hers. Half amusement, half calculation. Her eyes dropped again to my forearm. "You never pulled your name, huh?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer, because we both knew what she meant. In our world, names could be erased, redacted, removed from systems. Paper trails disappeared, badges turned in aliases, buried beneath layers of need to know. It was the price of certain assignments, the kind where you were there but officially weren't. Most people filed out when the time came, removed themselves from that world, chose clarity over shadows. I hadn't. Claire saw that. And she understood what it meant. "You still operating?" she asked, voice lower now. I shook my head once. "Not officially." She nodded, not surprised. Her eyes didn't leave mine. Around us, the range carried on in a strange, hushed rhythm. Soldiers went through motions, but you could see it. Heads turning more often than usual, glances darting toward us like they couldn't help it. They didn't know who she was, but they knew who I might be, and Claire's presence only confirmed it. Monroe was a ghost hunter. She didn't show up unless something needed verifying. I saw the young staff sergeant pretending to check the target system while straining to eavesdrop. Another soldier lingered near the water station, eyes fixed on us behind mirrored sunglasses. Everyone was trying to piece it together. But Claire wasn't giving them anything. She stepped slightly to the side, just enough to block me from full view. Not protectively, just subtly. "You know what they're thinking, right?" she said under her breath. I nodded. "They're trying to line you up with all the half-stories they've heard." I offered the faintest smile. "Good luck." Claire let out a small breath, almost a laugh. Still a damn ghost. Silence settled between us for a moment. "You made quite an impression," she added, glancing back toward the shredded target paper. Braddock almost dropped his clipboard. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The grouping spoke louder than any story ever could. "You broke the record," she continued, "and confirmed 3 rumors in one afternoon." She studied me for a beat longer. "You planning to stay?" I shrugged. "For now." Claire's gaze held steady. "Well, just know the second half of this story is going to spread faster than the first," I figured. She stepped back, eyes still on me. "And when it does, they'll want to know more than the legend. They'll want the truth." I met her eyes. "Then let them wonder." She nodded again. It wasn't approval. It was understanding. The kind only someone who had lived inside the same silence could give. Then, just like that, she turned and faded into the background again. The way she always did. Like smoke. No trail, no signature. Just absence that made you question if she'd really been there at all. But the moment lingered. Everyone had seen it. Claire Monroe didn't show up unless something, or someone, needed confirming. And now she had. The whispers that followed weren't questions anymore. They were realizations. They weren't just looking at someone who shot clean. They were looking at someone who had once operated in places they'd only heard about in briefing rooms, who had never filed for promotion, never showed up in official commendation lists, never stood on a podium yet, had quietly shaped the outcomes of missions where the stakes were life or global fallout. They didn't know my full story, but for the first time they knew one thing for sure: I wasn't just a good shot. I was someone who had survived places where shots were the last resort, not the first option. Someone who had been sent into the silence to bring others out. I cleaned the last of the oil from my rifle, packed it into its case, and zipped it shut. Not one person spoke to me directly. Not because they didn't want to. Because they didn't know how. How do you speak to a ghost when you realize she's real? You don't. You watch. You remember. And you carry that lesson in the way you stand a little straighter the next time you're handed a weapon. In the way you check your assumptions. And in the way you finally understand that silence, real silence, isn't absence, it's power. It started the way most storms do. In silence. A few misplaced details, numbers that didn't line up, a name on a roster that hadn't shown up at training, a certificate with a code that looked right but felt wrong. I wasn't looking for trouble. At the time, I was serving with a logistics audit unit on temporary assignment. It was quiet work, reviewing rotation records, cross-checking certifications with deployment eligibility. Tedious to most, but I liked the rhythm. Clean data, predictable systems. At least that's what I thought. The first red flag came folded inside a weekly update packet. A soldier had been greenlit for a specialized urban warfare course. The course itself was legitimate. The certificate was authentic. The code on the document matched the training database. But the name didn't. I had been at that rotation. I remembered every face because that class had run lean. Too few slots, too much demand. And I knew for a fact this guy hadn't been there. I told myself it was a clerical error. Maybe the paperwork had been filed under the wrong name. It happens. Systems aren't perfect. Maybe an admin tech typed in a wrong ID and no one caught it. I flagged the report, made a note, and moved on. Then it happened again. Another week, another packet. Another soldier who had supposedly passed a course I knew he hadn't attended. This one was even more obvious. He had been deployed overseas at the same time the training took place. Still, the certificate was there. Stamped. Logged. Verified. I began keeping a side file. At first it was just curiosity. I'm trained to look for patterns, so I watched. Every time a new name showed up with a suspicious cert, I added it to the file. Week by week it grew. 3, then 5, then 8. Different names, different units, same courses, same certifying entity, same training center. Fort Dalton. I hadn't thought about that place in years, not since I left Lane 7 behind. But when I traced the certification numbers back to their point of origin, Fort Dalton came up every single time. That was the moment my stomach turned. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was using the name. Maybe the issue wasn't at the source, but in the transmission. Maybe the problem wasn't Fort Dalton. It was someone lazy copying templates, filling gaps without checking records. But the deeper I looked, the harder it was to believe that. Because there was nothing sloppy about the way these fakes were built. They were precise, systematic, aligned down to the pixel. Whoever had done it wasn't cutting corners. They were bending the system deliberately. That's when I stopped logging files as a soldier and started documenting them as an operative. I knew how to collect intel. I knew how to move without drawing attention. My years in recon and counterinsurgency had taught me more than how to shoot. They'd taught me how to watch, how to wait, how to recognize when something looked too perfect. I began digging into email headers, login IDs, approval chains, anything that left a digital trail. These weren't anonymous entries. They were signed, approved, and filed. The same names kept surfacing. And one of those names kept making my hands go cold every time I saw it. Michael Bennett, my father. He had retired from active duty years ago, but stayed on in an advisory role at Fort Dalton. His influence hadn't faded with his uniform. In fact, it had grown. Everyone trusted him. He had built that trust over decades. By being consistent, efficient, respected. Respected enough that no one questioned his approvals. Respected enough that when his signature showed up, no one bothered to verify the rest. At first, I resisted the idea, told myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe someone was using his name. Maybe a junior officer had forged it. Maybe it was legacy system error. Something. Anything. Because the alternative, that he was involved, was too heavy to hold. I kept working in secret. I mirrored the internal email servers and began collecting message chains. I used metadata to map user activity against authorization timestamps. I compared field evaluations against their corresponding certifications and started to see where edits had been made. Slight changes in language. Date fields that didn't match surrounding documents. Approval notes added in a different font. I even tracked financial reimbursements. Small travel claims signed off for soldiers who were never on site. Per diem requests for hotels they never stayed in. All approved by the same small circle of senior consultants and program liaisons. And every trail, every path I followed led back to one place. Back to him. I found a note, handwritten, stuffed inside a folder that had been misfiled in a storage cabinet in the admin annex. The handwriting was unmistakable. Push this one through. Quietly. Initialed M. B. Still, I waited. I didn't act. Not yet. Because this wasn't about catching someone in a lie. This was about exposing a system built to protect itself. A system that used names like his to deflect scrutiny. If I moved too fast, the evidence could disappear. If I moved too publicly, it could be dismissed as personal. So I took my time. I downloaded text messages, snapshots from burner phones that instructors used for off-the-record coordination. I recorded hallway conversations, officers whispering about favor swaps and fast-tracked careers. I collected tip-offs from whistleblowers too scared to go to JAG, too embedded to go through channels. Some of them had seen the same names I had. Some of them had been forced to sign off on approvals they knew were wrong. And some of them had one thing in common. They didn't want to be first. But I wasn't afraid to be first. I kept all of it. Labeled, time-stamped, matched and cross-referenced. One folder became 5, then 10, then 2 drives, each one a record of choices made in the shadows, choices that hurt real soldiers, ones who didn't get the slot, ones who got deployed without training, ones who died because someone else skipped the hard part, all for influence, ego, favor. When I finally sat back and looked at the total picture, I realized what I had built. Not just a trail of mistakes. A system. One designed to elevate those who played the game and erase those who didn't. I knew what I had to do. But before I did, I found one last file. One I hadn't expected. It was a draft email. No recipient listed. Just one line typed clean across the top. I knew that girl would cause problems. She's always been defiant. Remove her from the candidate pool. Signed, Lieutenant Col Michael Bennett. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was personal. He hadn't confronted me. He hadn't questioned me. He'd just erased me, quietly, efficiently, like I was a logistical problem. I sat with that for a long time. Then I added it to the evidence packet and waited. Not for revenge, not for drama, but for the moment when silence would no longer protect him. Because he had taught me how to operate in the dark, but he had forgotten that I'd learned how to shine a light. There are betrayals you expect, the kind that come from politics, from broken promises, from the way systems fail people at the margins. And then there are the ones you never see coming, the ones with your last name attached, the ones signed by blood. I found the email late into one of my silent nights of sorting. I'd been cataloging everything, witness statements, receipts, voice memos, login timestamps. I'd worked my way through digital archives that most people didn't know existed. I thought I was ready for anything, but nothing prepares you for seeing your father's name at the bottom of a decision that erased you. It was short, blunt, no greeting, no soft language. I knew that girl would cause problems. She's always been defiant. Remove her from the candidate pool. Signed, Lieutenant Col Michael Bennett. I stared at it for longer than I should have, the screen glowing faintly in the dark, the cursor blinking like a silent metronome. That line sat heavy in my chest. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. I hadn't even known I was on the list. A short list. High-level clearance. The kind of opportunity that only came once. The kind of assignment that changed your career, that tested every inch of your training. It would have explained the sudden silence in the command loop a few years back, the strange drop-off in comms, the invitation that never came. It hadn't been politics. It had been him. He didn't confront me. He didn't call. He didn't challenge me face to face. He just erased me, effortlessly, efficiently, like I was a checkbox to be unmarked, a problem to be eliminated. And that was the moment it all clicked. This wasn't just about forged certifications or quiet favors. It wasn't just about ego or influence. It was about control. About a man who had built an identity out of order and couldn't stand the thought of someone, even his daughter, writing her own rules. I had been trouble from the start in his eyes. Too curious, too persistent, too quiet to be agreeable, too competent to be ignored. I didn't yell. I didn't rebel. I just kept showing up where I wasn't supposed to belong, not loud enough to challenge him, but steady enough to remind him that his control wasn't absolute. And that scared him more than anything, because it meant I didn't need him. Growing up, his silence was sharper than any punishment. It shaped rooms. It bent the temperature of a house. One look from him could make dinner feel like a courtroom. But now I understood something he never realized. I had learned his silence too well. Not as fear, but as fuel. I didn't scream when I read that email. I didn't slam my fist on the desk or send off an angry response. I just saved the file, labeled it, backed it up 3 times, and sat there in the dark, letting the betrayal settle into something solid. Not bitterness, not rage. Resolve. The kind of resolve that only comes when you finally stop pretending things will fix themselves. When you stop waiting for recognition or apology or understanding. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted the truth to exist somewhere other than inside my head, and I wanted him to see it. Not through confrontation. Not through some dramatic standoff. I wanted him to witness it the way I had spent my whole life witnessing him. Silently from a distance, feeling every word he never said. So I kept going, kept building the case, kept weaving the threads until the system he created started to tangle itself. The network was larger than I'd feared. Instructors who owed him favors, officers who turned blind eyes, soldiers who were fast-tracked without qualification, all because someone wanted to feel important again. The rot had spread beneath the surface for years, and it had his name at the root. But I didn't go public, not yet. Because you don't bring down a fortress by yelling at the walls. You study the foundation. You wait for the right moment. You let the pressure build. And you let it come from within. There were moments where the weight of it almost broke me. The knowledge that he had deliberately shut me out wasn't just painful, it was destabilizing. It made me question every interaction we'd ever had. Every nod. Every silence. Every time he looked past me and praised my brother instead. Had it always been there, this quiet disapproval? Or had it grown as I did, fed by the fact that I refused to shrink? He used to tell me that control was the highest form of strength, that a good soldier didn't flinch, didn't question, didn't falter. But now I saw the truth behind that lesson. Control for him had always been about containment, not strength. And I had slipped outside his containment. I had become something he couldn't narrate. And that to a man like him was the ultimate threat. So I stopped trying to make sense of it. I stopped asking why. And I started preparing. Every document I collected, I triple-sourced. Every piece of evidence was time-stamped, formatted, backed up in offline storage. I organized it not like a daughter fighting a father, but like a professional preparing a case that couldn't be undone. Because if I was going to pull this into the light, it couldn't be emotional. It had to be irrefutable. And I had to be ready to burn the bridge completely. I knew what it would cost. Not just him. Me. The whispers. The side glances. She went after her own father. The old guard would call it disloyalty. The system would question my motives. Some would accuse me of exaggeration. Others would say I had a personal vendetta. They wouldn't see the system. They'd see a family feud. But I didn't care, because there were good soldiers getting left behind while unqualified names filled the ranks. Because the uniform deserved better. Because I couldn't stand in front of another line of recruits and pretend I didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. And because I knew I wouldn't be the last person he erased. So I stayed quiet. Collected everything, waited for the right moment. Not for revenge, for reckoning. Because there's a difference between revenge and accountability. One satisfies your anger, the other clears the ground for something better. And I wasn't interested in being angry anymore. I was interested in truth, in integrity, in making sure no one else had to sit in the dark wondering why they'd been erased from a future they earned. My father taught me how to be quiet. But he never expected I'd use that silence to dismantle the empire he built. And he definitely never expected I'd do it without ever raising my voice. The hearing room wasn't a courtroom in the traditional sense. No marble columns, no solemn gavel, no polished wood panels. It was a converted training hall on base. Folding chairs in measured rows, 3 flags pinned to the back wall, and a table draped in dull olive cloth, where the reviewing officers sat shoulder to shoulder. No press, no observers, no audience, just brass protocols and truth waiting to be spoken aloud. That morning I dressed the same way I always did. Crisp fatigues, clean boots, no ribbons, no rank on display. My badge and clearance card stayed tucked into my inner pocket out of sight. I didn't need them to speak for me. Not today. I walked in not as a daughter, not as the woman who had stood at lane 7 and left a record in shredded paper. I walked in as a professional, an investigator, a soldier who had watched systems bend and finally decided it was time to hold the line. Michael Bennett was already seated when I entered. His posture was what I remembered, rigid arms, folded, jaw tight. He didn't look at me, didn't blink. But I knew him too well to miss the signs. The slow breathing. The extra second between each blink. He hadn't expected me to show. I sat 2 rows back, not at the table for witnesses. I wasn't scheduled to testify. I was listed as an observing party per standard audit protocol, but protocol was just a guide, and truth has a way of rewriting the script. The hearing began with procedural formalities: reading of complaints, presentation of training discrepancies, a review of Fort Dalton's certification processes. Names were read, a few low-ranking officers were mentioned. Nothing yet pointed to a senior figure, nothing yet named him, until the presiding officer asked the question that shifted the air in the room. Is there anyone present who believes they hold relevant information? My heart didn't race, my palms didn't sweat. I just stood. Chairs creaked, heads turned. Michael looked up. First at the panel, then at me. I stepped forward, slow, steady. No theatrics. Ma'am, I said to the lead officer, what I'm about to submit is not a statement of grievance. It is a report, fully sourced, independently verified. A long pause. The room held its breath. I placed a sealed folder on the table. Inside was everything: emails, audio files, certification discrepancies, instructor statements, financial logs, memos with forged signatures, a map of a system that had favored familiarity over fitness and loyalty over legitimacy. Included in the file 7 separate training manipulations signed or greenlit by Lieutenant Colonel Michael Bennett. I didn't add any emphasis. I didn't need to. The documents would speak. The presiding officer opened the folder, flipped through the tabs, lips tightening as she scanned. I've also attached a secondary note, I continued. An internal email with my name, which resulted in my removal from a classified candidate selection process. No appeal, no notice, no record until I found it myself. I stopped talking then. Everything else they needed was already in the folder. I turned back to face him. Not as his daughter, not as the girl he once silenced across dinner tables, but as the soldier he had tried to erase. He met my eyes, and for the first time he didn't try to control the moment. The presiding officer looked up. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett, she asked. Would you like to respond? He didn't sigh. He didn't shift blame. He didn't argue. He just shook his head once and said quietly, No, ma'am. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was heavy, like everyone in that room had just watched the ground shift beneath them. And in that moment, I realized something I didn't expect. I didn't feel victorious. There was no triumph in watching him shrink into the stillness. There was only freedom. For the first time in my life, I was no longer walking in his shadow. I had built something of my own, quietly, relentlessly, piece by piece. And now it stood taller than the reputation he used to command. I sat back down. No applause, no nods, just that same old silence I had learned to carry. The hearing continued. Formal statements were read. The panel announced that a full investigation into Fort Dalton's certification practices would proceed. Michael Bennett's advisory status was placed under immediate review. Additional audits were scheduled. It wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. But that was the beauty of it. No flames, no shouting, just facts. And facts can burn just as hot as any fire when they're laid bare. After the session adjourned, I walked out into the hallway alone. The light outside was sharp early afternoon, cutting down through the windows like lines on a blueprint. A junior officer stepped aside to let me pass. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me said enough. He knew, and he understood. I didn't stop, didn't slow. I just walked forward, because the truth wasn't about what had just been said in that room. It was about what couldn't be unsaid. And some truths don't need permission to matter. They just need to be spoken, quietly, and without apology. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, no markings. Just my name written in tight, familiar handwriting. Deliberate, disciplined. Even the way the letters curved told me who it was from before I opened it. Michael Bennett didn't waste ink, not on paper, not on people. I stood in the kitchen with the envelope in one hand and a half-warm mug of coffee in the other, unsure of what I was supposed to feel. The tribunal had wrapped up just a week prior. Quietly, efficiently, just like the system he once helped control. His name had been formally removed from all advisory roles. His certifications revoked. The commendations he used to wear like armor, recalled. They'd scrubbed him from the walls, from the records, from the base he helped build. There were no headlines, no disgrace, just erasure. The punishment was fitting. Not loud, just permanent. I had almost forgotten to expect a reaction. But here it was, tucked in a paper that felt strangely heavy, despite how little space it took up. I opened it slowly. Inside was a sheet of plain white stationery. No seal, no letterhead. Folded twice crisp. It looked like it had been rewritten a few times. Edges worn ink faint in some places. 3 sentences. I used to think you were soft. That you didn't have what it takes. I was wrong. That was it. No greeting. No sign-off. Just the truth. Or at least his version of it. I stood there for a long time reading those words over and over again. Not because I needed to confirm what they said, but because I couldn't quite believe they were real. He had never written to me before. Growing up, communication with him had been a series of corrections and commands. His version of praise was silence. His way of showing love was order. If he ever gave me credit, it was in indirect fragments shared with someone else. Never to my face, never without a caveat. But this was acknowledgement. Stripped down, no excuses, no justification, and yet it didn't feel like a victory. Because this letter came too late, not just in years, but in everything it had cost to receive it. He could have said this when I graduated basic, when I passed selection, when I came home with deployment fatigue and eyes that didn't blink for days. He could have said it when I showed up for family holidays and sat 2 chairs down, always the quiet one, while Lucas recounted his promotions. But he waited until everything was gone, until I had burned through the fog of expectation and proven that silence wasn't surrender, that defiance didn't mean disrespect, that control wasn't strength, not the kind that lasts. He waited until there was nothing left to protect. No image, no authority, no reputation, only truth. And even then it wasn't an apology. It was an observation. I didn't expect him to say sorry. That wasn't who he was. His whole life had been built on never admitting weakness. And in his world, change came only after the damage had already been done. I walked to the living room and sat on the floor, legs folded beneath me, the letter open in my lap. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe heavily. I just sat there rereading the 3 lines until they blurred into the paper. What do you do with words like that? You can't frame them. You can't respond. You just carry them. I thought about calling him. Once. Just to say something, anything, to ask what made him write it, to ask why now. But then I thought about that girl, me at 13, who stood in the hallway clutching her Arabic textbooks while he told her to drop the language and choose Latin because it was more respectable. I thought about the woman who'd stood at lane 7 while he mocked her in front of strangers. The daughter who was erased from a future because she refused to be small. I thought about all the nights I had trained until my hands bled, the mornings I'd stood in foreign terrain listening for gunfire beneath prayer calls, the faces of people I had pulled out of burning homes, the soldiers who had trusted me because I never flinched. Not once. He hadn't seen any of that, not because he couldn't, because he refused to. So, no, I didn't call. I didn't write back. Not out of anger, but because there are some things you can't fix with late confessions. He wasn't apologizing for what he did. He was admitting that he finally saw what he couldn't control. Me? He called me soft once. He used to think my silence was weakness, that my kindness made me fragile, that my quiet made me invisible. But what he never understood, and maybe finally does now, is that being quiet doesn't mean you're not strong. It means you know exactly when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. I folded the letter along the original crease, put it in a wooden box I kept at the back of my closet. The box held a few small things. Dog tags, a photo of my first unit, a worn patch from a uniform I hadn't worn in years, I didn't label it, didn't lock it, but I didn't throw it away either. Because even though it was too late, it still mattered. Not for what it fixed, but for what it admitted. It didn't change the past. It didn't erase the nights I went unnoticed. It didn't make up for the fact that he had actively worked against me. It didn't heal the scar of being treated like a liability in my own father's eyes. But it told me that I wasn't invisible anymore, even if he had to lose everything to see it. He didn't call again. He didn't follow up. But I heard he left his position quietly, didn't contest it, didn't fight the consequences. That in its own way was another kind of letter, a signature in silence, the kind he had taught me to recognize. I went back to work, because there were still soldiers who needed better leaders, still systems worth protecting, still truths that needed standing behind. Not all stories need an apology. Some just need to be acknowledged, even if all they come with is 3 quiet lines on a blank page. The first time I returned to Fort Dalton after the tribunal, no one recognized me. That was exactly how I wanted it. There were new faces at the gate, young guards with fresh eyes and tighter grips on their rifles. They didn't know my name and they didn't ask. I signed in like anyone else, gave the base liaison a polite nod and kept moving. No rank, no introduction, just a name on a clipboard and a bag slung over my shoulder. The range hadn't changed. Same sun-baked gravel, same wind that cut low through the fences, same scuffed benches beneath the rusted awnings. Even Lane 7 looked the same, tucked at the far end away from the center lanes where chatter still filled the air. But something in the atmosphere felt different, lighter maybe. Or maybe I was just breathing differently this time. I wasn't here to break records. I wasn't here to prove anything. I was here to teach. The Army didn't ask me to come back. I volunteered quietly, not for a promotion or position, just to give back what I had learned in the only way I knew how, without fanfare, without noise, without pretending that glory is what makes someone a soldier. They assigned me a rotation of new recruits, 18 to 24 years old, some fresh from basic, some with 1 deployment under their belt, most trying to look more confident than they felt. The kind of young soldiers who were still full of questions, but didn't know how to ask them yet. I knew that look. I had worn it once, too. No one called me ma'am. No one saluted. Most of them didn't even know who I was. Just that someone from Recon was visiting to run a 2-day marksmanship and situational awareness course. That suited me just fine. The first thing I told them was not how to hold their rifles, but how to breathe. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6, I said. Control doesn't start in your hands, it starts in your lungs. They looked puzzled at first. Some exchanged glances like they were waiting for the real lesson to begin. I didn't rush it. I didn't fill the silence. I just let the space exist between my words and their expectations. By the second drill, they stopped looking at each other. They started listening. I didn't talk about the record. I didn't bring up Lane 7 or what happened the last time I stood on that line. That story had made its rounds without my help, reshaped into half-truths and whispered versions that always left out what mattered most. I didn't need them to know the legend. I needed them to understand the foundation beneath it. Don't chase the target, I told one young private who kept missing low and left. Let the shot come to you. Let the wind tell you what it wants. Observation first, reaction second. He nodded, sweat clinging to the corners of his helmet. His breathing slowed. The next round hit center mass. Another recruit asked how to clear a hallway under stress. I didn't talk about tactics. I asked, "What's the first thing you hear in silence?" He blinked. "Nothing." "Exactly," I said. "That's where danger lives. In the nothing. Don't rush to fill it. Let it speak first." I wasn't there to create perfect shooters. I was there to shape presence. To teach them that clarity is a weapon. That stillness isn't passive. It's powerful. That every decision made under pressure has a breath behind it. And the better you control the breath, the better you survive the decision. They started asking better questions by the afternoon. Not about how to shoot faster, but how to know when not to fire. Not how to dominate a space, but how to read it. How to recognize when silence is more useful than sound. That's when I knew they were learning. I didn't stay in the center. I walked the perimeter, watched their footwork, the way their fingers tensed when holding the trigger, the way their eyes darted too quickly before every decision. I corrected gently, sparingly, the way someone once taught me, by making me feel safe enough to slow down. The second day, I brought out a weathered box I had kept stored for years. Inside was a plaque I had commissioned after the tribunal. Nothing fancy, just a strip of brushed metal mounted to a narrow wood base, 4 words etched into it: reserved until she returns. Shud. At lunch, when the range cleared out, I took the small electric screwdriver from my bag, walked to lane 7 and fastened it into the bench just above the rest area. The sound of the drill wasn't loud, but it was final. No one asked what it meant. But later that day, a young soldier passed by lane 7 and stopped. He stood there for a minute, just looking. He didn't touch the plaque. He didn't take a photo. He just read the words, then turned back and rejoined the group with a little more stillness in his walk. That was enough. They asked me at the end of the rotation why I never became a formal instructor. You've got the record, the deployments, the rank 1 said. Why not? I smiled quiet. Because not everything worth teaching comes with a classroom. Some things have to be passed down the way I received them. In silence, in the small adjustments, in the space between ego and awareness. You don't teach someone how to be fearless. You teach them how to keep moving even when fear shows up. You don't train people to chase applause. You teach them to endure long after the noise dies down. That's what lane 7 meant to me. Not a record. A reminder. That quiet wins don't need an audience. And sometimes the most lasting legacies are left behind in steel and stillness. The rotation ended with handshakes, nods, a few awkward thank yous that didn't quite know how to say what they meant. I didn't correct them. I let their silence speak. Before I left the range, I walked back to the plaque, placed my hand on it for just a moment, not to claim it, but to remember it. I didn't know when I'd return again, but the lane would wait. It always had. It was a quiet afternoon when I packed away the M24. No ceremony, no final shot. Just me, a soft cloth, and a long wooden case I had kept tucked away for years. I unlatched the lid, lined the inside with a folded piece of fabric. Nothing fancy, just something soft worn from time and travel. My hands moved on their own, cleaning the rifle one last time, brushing over the worn grip, the chipped paint, the scuffs that had stories none of them had ever heard. Each mark on that rifle was a mile, a mission. A moment when silence made the difference. It had been with me through everything. Kandahar rooftops, sun-baked ridgelines in Aleppo, the cold bite of midnight in places where maps lied and only instinct mattered. It wasn't just a weapon. It was part of who I had become. But I wasn't that person anymore. Not because I couldn't be. Because I didn't need to be. The rifle slid into the case with a soft, familiar weight. I ran one more pass over the scope, then closed the lid. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I locked it once and slipped the key into the back pocket of a jacket I rarely wore. Then I stood still for a while, listening to the quiet of the room. There were no voices calling my name. No applause. Just the low hum of memory and the faint scent of oil and dust that clung to the air like old stories refusing to fade. Outside, the base carried on as it always had. Training rotations rotated, buses came and went, orders were barked, recruits stumbled, corrected, learned. The world kept moving. And that was the way it should be. The last class I taught had finished 3 days earlier. They had left in small groups. Quiet nods, a few handshakes, a few more that just lingered for a moment near lane 7 before walking off. None of them had asked for stories. Not directly, but their eyes had shifted. When I first arrived, some of them had looked at me like I was a footnote, a name on an outdated training schedule. Just another instructor filling in space. By the end, they looked at me differently. Not because they had discovered some hidden legend or found out the full story. They didn't need to know every detail. They just saw how I stood, how I spoke, or didn't. And sometimes that's enough to teach more than any resume ever could. They learned in the pauses, in the way I adjusted their stance without explaining why, in the way I stepped into a clearing and waited listening until they started to hear it too. The rhythm of the ground, the movement of the wind, the space between the noise. I left no handouts, no manuals, only that plaque on Lane 7. Reserved until she returns. I hadn't told anyone what it meant. It wasn't meant to be explained. It was meant to be felt. And maybe one day one of them would walk back there and understand. Maybe they already did. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low across the lot, I walked the edge of the range one last time. Not to say goodbye. I don't believe in clean endings. I believe in moments that pass through you and leave you changed. Lane 7 was still there, quiet, undisturbed. The wind swept across the bench and rustled the edge of the plaque. I didn't touch it, just looked at it and let the moment pass through. No one followed me as I left. No one called out. I passed by a group of young soldiers gathered near the mess laughing at something on one of their phones. One of them looked up. Recognition flickered across his face. Brief, uncertain. Then he nodded. I nodded back. That was enough. I didn't need them to say anything. I didn't need validation. What I had built didn't live in medals or spoken praise. It lived in the spaces they hadn't even noticed had shifted, in the posture of the one who no longer flinched when making a call, in the quiet confidence of the recruit who no longer rushed to fill silence with noise. They wouldn't remember my name, not all of them. But they'd remember how they felt when they stood beside me, and that would live longer than any record. I reached the parking lot and placed the case gently in the back of my truck. The gravel crunched beneath my boots one last time as I closed the door and leaned against the frame for a moment, taking in the view. Not of the base, but of everything it had meant. The weight of what had been carried here. The pain. The growth. The quiet. The healing. Because that's what this really was. Not an end, a reckoning, a restoration of something I didn't even know I had lost. I didn't leave with triumph. I left with clarity. There were no goodbyes, no announcements, just a quiet exit the same way I had come in. And as I pulled out of the lot, the late sun flaring across the windshield, I thought about all the times I had driven away from places like this before. Tired, guarded, uncertain. This time I felt none of that. I felt peace, because the past no longer held me. The silence I carried was no longer the one he gave me. It was the one I chose. And for the first time in my life, it was enough. Thank you for walking through this journey with us. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to support you? Have you ever had to prove your worth, not with words, but through quiet resilience? If Grace's story spoke to something in you, we'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if these kinds of stories move you, stories of strength, healing, and quiet courage, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. That way you won't miss the next story waiting to be heard. We're here for the quiet fighters, the unseen heroes, and anyone who's ever had to reclaim their voice. You're not alone. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and keep listening.